We know that access control is one of the most important parts of protecting our information assets and, of course, our information systems. The most common form of access control we use is based on password or passphrases. This is used to authenticate the user. A user has identified themselves as to whom they are, and now they have to authenticate or validate that they are that person that they have claimed. The problem with many password-based systems is that they are static values. It's a password which remains the same for 30, 45 days, and therefore that password is subject to replay attacks. If a person can learn another user's password, they would be able to log in as that other user until such time as that password has expired. The other problem is that many passwords are quite easily guessed. They may be based on common words or well-known values such as, ID numbers or birthdays. The other thing is that especially with cameras today, it's fairly easy to capture a person's password. This is often done through what we call shoulder surfing, looking over another person's shoulder, or sometimes called swiping attacks. This will allow a person to learn what the password or PIN number is that is being entered then by the user. So one of the solutions is to go to one-time or dynamic passwords. These are usually generated by some type of a token. A token generates this dynamic password which can only be used once and then will be changed before, of course, it can be used again. Now, there are a number of different types of token generators out there, such as synchronous, time-based devices, or even event-based devices, where the access control server knows what is then the value on that user's token at any one time. And those two values are kept in sync between the access control server and the token. The other, of course, is a type which is based on asynchronous, or what we call challenge response. Challenge response is where the access control server generates a challenge that is sent out to the user, and the user, using their token, has to then enter that challenge in and respond back to the access control server with the hashed value generated by the token. A type of challenge response like this is known as an asynchronous type of login session. And these challenge response also are a one-time value. That value that was used cannot then be used again. Some of the tokens out there are based on time, and every couple of moments they will change the token value. Whereas other times it can be based on events. Every time a person tries to log in, they would have to then press a button, for example, on the token, which would generate the next value on that token in whatever sequence it was using. There also, of course, are tokens that then combine other values, such as we can say PIN number is something you know, or sometimes even biometrics. But a token itself is really a form of authentication based on something you have. Usually we'll call that ownership or possession-based systems. The third form of authentication, that which is based on what you are, is based then on biometrics. Biometrics take a look at two different characteristics of a person. The first are their physiological characteristics. What are they as a person? Things like a fingerprint, an iris scan, and a retina scan. We then have a number that are behavioral based. And behavioral based looks at how do you do things? How do you type? How do you speak? Or, for example, how do you sign your name? The problem with, of course, biometrics is that they are subject to errors, like any other device. The first type of error, known as a false reject rate or type 1 error, is one that will increase as the sensitivity of the device is then increased as well. The idea behind, of course, a type 1 error is we have an employee or a person who should have been authorized to get in is unable to get in because the biometric device says that's not you. They've been falsely rejected. On the other hand, we have the other type of error known as a false acceptance rate. False acceptance rate, or type 2 error, is when a person is able to get onto our systems as if they are somebody else, when they shouldn't have. And this type of an error, of course, is much more serious. Now we have an unauthorized person able to get access and possibly able to do harm. We can adjust the sensitivity of then a biometric device from a very low level of sensitivity where everybody gets in who should, and plus a lot of people that shouldn't, and increase that sensitivity to a much higher level, which means that people that should not get in will be kept out. The system will become more accurate or more precise, and it will be able then to prevent unauthorized access. But the problem is, as we increase the sensitivity, we will also then increase the false reject rate. More and more employees every day will have to go through additional screening or additional verification before they are allowed in. Now, these two types of errors will intersect in something we often call then the crossover error rate, or sometimes known as the equal error rate. When we are looking at considering and comparing different types of biometric devices, we will usually use the crossover error rate as the indication of what is the optimum value of accuracy of that device. Now, that doesn't mean we'll use that setting. If we have a very secure facility, we may increase the sensitivity beyond the crossover error rate just to make sure we keep unauthorized people out. We use biometrics a lot today. However, they're expensive. It costs a lot, not only, of course, to install all of the equipment necessary for this to work, but also to enroll every user. For every user to be then registered with the system, and in some cases, replace that registration over time as well. There's also the delay then in admission, the time to process. It takes time for a biometric to be able to then to recognize a fingerprint and know that this truly is an authorized person. The other thing is that a biometric is keeping what's probably the ultimate in personally identifiable information. It's storing sensitive data on our employees or customers, which we have to protect, because if a person's fingerprint was compromised, well, obviously there's no way to replace that either. The other thing is that biometrics can be affected by medical conditions. A retina scan, which measures the pattern of blood vessels in the back of the eye, can very much be affected by high blood pressure and diabetic retinopathy. A fingerprint can be affected then by a cut or a scar. A voice pattern recognition system can be affected by somebody who has a cold, for example. And the other problem with biometrics is simply user resistance. Users feel this is very personal, and in some cases will resist then the use of biometrics because they don't feel comfortable with having then to present their very personal information to that system repeatedly all day long. So some of the types of biometrics that are out there. They're the ones that look at the veins in the palm of the hand as well as the lines within the palm of the hand. These are often known as venous scanners and palm scan readers. There's ones that look at the length of fingers, the width of fingers. They look at the, in some cases, even hand topology, the height of the bumps in the back of the hand. These hand geometry systems also are fairly accurate. The iris, of course, is the colored portion around the pupil of the eye. This is often picked up using a camera, and far more acceptable to most users than a retina scan. A retina scan is actually looking into the back of the eye and capturing then the image of the blood vessels in the back of the eye on the retina. Quite often we see the use of fingerprints, and fingerprints are very unique, and looking at the various whorls within, of course, the fingerprint, we can then match then that fingerprint with a very high level of accuracy. We have facial recognition systems that look at the characteristics of a person's face, the distance between the eyes, and so on. And there's also the behavior-based biometrics. The three most common for this are signature dynamics, which look at how do you sign your name. And what it looks at then is the angle you hold the pen at and the acceleration as you move across your signature. There's also then voice recognition, where we pick up then a person's voice as they say a certain phrase. And the keystroke monitoring systems. These systems are incredibly accurate because everybody, when they type on a keyboard, has their own hand, if you want to call it that. And each person, as they type, has a certain delay rate. How long do they hold down a key? And a certain transfer rate. How quickly do they move between keys? A keystroke monitoring system can very quickly pick up if a different person is typing on that keyboard. The idea of access control is very often related then to bringing in implementations of single sign-on. And the idea of this is that instead of a user having now to remember 20 or more different IDs on different systems, they have one common ID that can be used on multiple systems. Now, because of that, they only have to remember one password, and hopefully, therefore, they would choose a better password. Now, we can understand that one of the first and most obvious advantages of this is that if a person only has to remember one password, they're probably going to be better at remembering it. We're going to have fewer password reset calls to the help desk. In order for single sign-on to really work well, it should be based on a centralized management system, where all user profiles are managed at one common central point, so that we're able then to ensure that all users' access is then managed in a consistent way across all systems. The idea of centralized management very much improves the idea of compliance, and consistency in how then access is actually provided. This then generates a consistent level of risk. We know that the risk of a person getting onto a system is the same no matter which system they're using, because it's all being governed by this one front end or even back end single sign-on system. The idea of centralized management also makes it easier to report on compliance to senior management and, of course, to regulators. Because everything is being done in one place by one team, it's much easier to know and to review the access that the various individuals have. But we realize there are some very significant disadvantages to single sign-on. Single sign-on may become a single point of compromise, a single point of failure. If a person learns another person's single sign-on password, they now have access to everything that user had. If the single sign-on system itself goes down, nobody gets on the system anywhere. One of the common implementations of single sign-on, which has been around since the early days, is Kerberos. Kerberos was developed at MIT on a project they initially called Athena. And it was meant to be then a single sign-on solution for use in a distributed computing environment. Kerberos itself is built into all of our Windows operating systems today. Kerberos is a single sign-on in that you would log into a key distribution center, and that key distribution center knows the user profiles of all users. It then will generate a time-based ticket that user can use when they want to access one of the many resources controlled by that Kerberos environment. Of course, this does bring in the risk here of system compromise and system failure. If the Kerberos key distribution center itself was to be unavailable, that means that nobody would get on the system. So we need to, one, protect the KDC itself, but also we have to make sure we have redundancy in place in case then the primary server does fail. Some of the other single sign-on solutions that are out there and very commonly used today, of course, is federated identity management. And federated identity management is where a number of business partners actually have an agreement between themselves that if a person logs in at one point, that login and those login credentials will be accepted then by the other parties to that identity management agreement. The idea of federated is quite often based then on the issuance of what we call security assertions. Security assertions are artifacts issued then under SAML, Security Assertion Markup Language. We also have things like OAuth, and many of us are very familiar, of course, with the various single sign-on solutions today, where you can log into a portal and from that portal have access to many resources in behind, even of other companies. Or it could be you want to log into a website, but that website says you can log in with your Facebook or Google ID because they will accept then that proof of who you are based then on the information you've provided logging in, say, using your Facebook account. This, of course, is bringing in this whole idea of making access to our systems much simpler by having one single sign-on product that is managing all that access, based as we see here on Federated Identity Management, SAML, and OAuth.